Hi everyone, I'm Claire Flannery. Delighted to be here with the session today with Iconic. To tell you a little bit about me, I'm a coaching psychologist and HR consultant, and I've over 15 years experience really working with organizations on different types of HR scenarios. And over the last number of months, I've been focusing a lot of my time around helping businesses reopen and organizations get back to work and back to the office through the pandemic. So today, really, I've just kind of come off an employer briefing, and this is the briefing for employees. We're really going to be looking at a brief overview of what are the things to consider as you're transitioning back to the office. And I'm conscious that there's potentially quite a wide variety of people either on the call today or listening back, in that for some of you, perhaps your business was closed and you're on layoff, and now it's reopening as we kind of reopen business and society in Ireland. Or for others, perhaps you're working from home for an extended period of time and now you're coming back into the office. Or for others, you're not quite there yet and you'll be coming in the next 1 month or starting to come in. So lots of different scenarios, and I've tried to kind of tailor the talk to that, so it is quite broad. But what I would say is I've left plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of today. So as we go through, if there's anything in particular that you're wondering about, feel free to pop it in the chat and I'll come on to it at the end. And just to say, you can put it in the chat group and everyone can see it, or you can send me a private message and I'll pick it up and we can talk through it at the end. That's no problem. I will be kind of asking different questions as we go through as well, just to get a sense of where everybody is at. Okay, so what are we going to look at today then? Right, so first of all, we're going to take a little bit of time to just take stock over the last few months. Obviously, there's been massive change for people, both personal change, professional change, about as much change as we couldn't even have anticipated. But we'll take time to kind of take stock about that and then start to look at making the mindset shift of returning to work. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at how you can adapt to the new work environment. So we look at what kind of things can you expect, and then within that, what are your employer and your obligations as an employee. And through that, particularly when we get onto that section, then you might start to think about some, if you don't have them already, questions that you're really wondering about your own circumstances as you're returning to work. And so as I said, I've allowed for a good bit of time at the end to kind of work through any of those questions. So when we look at over the last couple of months, and I'd ask you now, actually, can you just put into the chat group, what's your current situation? So are you back in the office, planning to go back in the office? Has your business been closed? Has been open all along? Just pop in to give me a sense of what's been going on over the last number of months. I mean, really, when we look back, I mean, you know, things came to very much an abrupt change for many, kind of early March for some, mid-March for others. Just seeing there, okay, continue to work remotely, currently back in the office. Other people back in the office for about 3 weeks, previously working from home. Returning on Monday, kids not back, employers make me go back. Okay, we can talk about that. I'm back in the office and was working from home before. Okay, so there's quite a variety of people who are back, going back, and so on. Okay, so let's have a look at, you know, the last number of months from a change point of view. Just give you slides that work for me. Okay. So when we look at change and transition, this is an image that I use quite a lot, right? But when we look at the last number of months, so mid-March, there was a significant change, and as the weeks kind of went on, you know, the impact of that change became much more obvious for us. And you know, the last number of months, as I said, perhaps you have been laid off, perhaps you have been working from home over the last while, but it was a massive change. Somebody mentioned about childcare, you know, schools closed, childcare closed. So anybody with with children was working, perhaps working from home, looking after their children as well, and perhaps even homeschooling. You know, like I'm not even going to go over all the different things that changed, but it was just a massive change. And you know, when we look at understanding change and transition, these are two kind of useful illustrations on top of one another here. One is the Kubler-Ross grief curve, and it's called the grief curve. It's used a lot in business about change, but it did initially come out of trying to understand grief, and that's the curve there. And that, you know, when something comes to an end, or when we're grieving, often we can feel quite shocked, angry, fearful, or sad, and then that can move into a stage of, I suppose, you know, just feeling really confused, disorientated, skeptical that things are ever going to improve. And then into new beginnings, we're feeling excited and energized and committed. And so that curve is used quite broadly, right? You know, as I said, it's talked about from a grief point of view. I will say, I think I did read something a couple of months ago. It was a Harvard Business Review article, and it talked about how this is grief, you know, what's been going on the last number of months. And obviously some people have really been dealing with grief in terms of life and death situations. But for many others as well, you know, some of you, I'm sure, may have your own businesses that, you know, that came to ground to a halt. Life as you knew it. Perhaps some of you had big plans for the summer that all got put on hold. And so look, it was massive change. I think there was an initial kind of denial about what's happening. And then when we realized the full extent of what was going on, you know, and how small our worlds really needed to become, quite shocked and angry. So I do think that grief is quite a relevant emotion to talk about in this context. So I mean, you can look at that across, let's say, from March to now as to what's been going on from a change point of view, but also, I mean, within that there's been lots of little changes, and as we've seen with the reopening and the different phases, each of those has brought a different change. And I know I heard lots of when the phases were brought forward last month, so many people felt quite shocked and in denial and fearful, and feeling like, oh, I wasn't quite ready for this. This is not how I saw it happening. I thought it was going to be slower. And so, where some people were delighted, and you know, so even within that, there's been changes, and you know, it can be at the same point in time a whole manner of emotions across the change curve. And what I like about this one in particular is you'll see this endings, neutral zone, and new beginnings. And this is someone called William Bridges looks at, so the change is something like a situation that's happening to us. So in effect, what has happened in Ireland to do with the pandemic. But there's a psychological transition. You know, the transition is really more of a psychological aspect of how we're responding to it. And that's the piece about, you know, endings and feeling in this kind of neutral zone where we're not really sure what's going on, and into kind of new beginnings. So this is quite helpful in looking at how can we look after ourselves as we move through the different stages, and also just acknowledge that it is completely normal. You know, it's completely normal to be feeling, let's say, if we look at as we transition back to work, it's completely normal to be feeling super excited and energized about the idea of going back, but it's also completely normal to feel very confused and not really understand what's going to be involved, what's going to look like, how's it all going to work, or feeling a bit skeptical about, sure, we'll only be back in, and you know, we'll have a second wave and we'll all be home again, you know, all those kind of thoughts and emotions. And also very normal to feel, you know, quite sad about, you know, we have been at home for quite a period of time, and in many cases there have been things that lots of things that people didn't want to happen, but there have been some things that people have been telling me they've been finding quite refreshing. So whether it's not having to commute to work, getting to spend more time with their family. And so sometimes people are feeling quite sad about that change as we transition back. So tell me, so again, pop into the chat, let me know, like, where are people at, you know, in terms of, like, if you were to pick one emotion to describe how you're feeling at the moment, what would it be? Excited to leave the house, but nervous about risks. yeah, for sure. And this is the thing, you know, it is like anxious or anticipating changes. Yeah, it is such a wide range of emotions, acceptance of the situation. Yeah, and like that one, excited to leave the house. You know, I mean, I've got three small kids here. The idea of how, you know, going into an office and having a cup of coffee by myself sounds amazing. But then there's so much, you know, that general reopening. It feels quite, you know, quite daunting and getting out. 2 hours commute on a train, yeah, nervous about that, absolutely understandable. And the state of uncertainty. I mean, I think this is, you know, it's really difficult because one of the things about this change, often when you're dealing with big change, you can kind of see what's going to happen down the line. You know, when you get to a certain point, you can start to look at, okay, this is kind of where we draw a line in the sand, and it's going to be different, and we'll be back to the office. But we really don't know. There is so much uncertainty, and I think that's what's really difficult for people. Like, we get, you know, as we look at kind of going back, there is lots of talk about a second wave, and people, you know, thinking about, are we going to be in a lockdown situation again, or how's it going to work in the office? And then even broadly thinking about, when I go back, you know, is my job going to be there long term? Like, there's just so much ambiguity and uncertainty out there, and you know, it is really difficult. And so I think, you know, we'll come on to it in a minute, but it's how can we get a bit of control over the few months ahead, and what is within our control, we'll have a bit of a look at. And it sounds like within that there are some pieces, if I don't come on to them when we get to the Q&A, that would be relevant around if anyone's kind of wondering about commuting, continuing to work from home, and those. So I'll just kind of make a note of that. Some other things to think about is around, okay, so I don't usually use, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's used for motivation, and if you haven't seen it before, it essentially says that you can't move up in this triangle or hierarchy until your needs are fully met at each stage. And so I said, it's not something I typically use, but I think it's really relevant in terms of what's been going on with the pandemic, because if we look at, you know, all of a sudden we could have been, you know, maybe there were many people in early March who were absolutely at that self-actualization point of view, you know, and really enjoying what they're doing professionally, and, you know, learning and being really engaged and innovating. And then overnight, we got thrown right down into the physiological needs space. And, you know, if we think back to the whole toilet roll saga and so on, in fact, I think this has been shared previously, with toilet roll being on the bottom one for physiological needs. But it's just the extent of what's been going on, like the concern, if you think back to the concerns about whether to be able to get enough food, and then with the stress impact on sleep and all these different things. So I think it's very relevant to think about that in the context of this change, and in the context of going back into the office, and think about, okay, what do I need? And really, for you as an employee, so what information do I need to feel like this need has been satisfied? And so if I look at this in the context of engagement and in the workplace, so if we look at kind of basic needs here, is around your workspace, so making sure that you have the fundamental resources to do your job. And if we think about it, whether you're transitioning back into the office full-time, or continuing to work from home partly and back in the early days of everyone working from home, you know, there's lots of talk of people working from an Ireland board and so on, and that was fine in a kind of emergency situation. But as we're looking, well, it wasn't fine, you know, we kind of had to make do, but as we look to the months ahead, you know, now it's more about looking at, okay, how do we make sure that we have the basic resources to do our job? An Ireland board is not good as a medium to term, even to long term solution. So looking at the workspace, and then like security and stability. So if, you know, from a need point of view, if you're having concerns about job security, what is within your control about that? What can you do about that? A safe work environment that is free from threats of physical and emotional harm. That's really quite relevant at the moment. So as you come back into work, into the office, making sure that you are comfortable with the health and safety measures that are put in place, that you're not overly concerned about risks to your physical health, or in fact your emotional health. And then also, if you're continuing to work from home, that piece about how can you make sure that it's a safe work environment. And so those pieces really need to be satisfied before we can move up into that space of getting back into that kind of belonging to a team, positive workplace relationships. But again, like, people are at different stages, and I've heard lots of nice stories about teams getting stronger from the time spent working from home, because they've got to know one another a little bit more and seen insights into each other's lives and general kind of challenges and so on. But it's how do we make sure that we continue that as we go back to work. So I won't dwell on this in too much detail, but it's really just to highlight that it's if you're kind of worried, if you're worried about your safe work environment, it's understandable that you're not really focused on how can I reach my true potential, and if we're feeling very ambivalent and unsure about what's happening, it's perfectly normal to not be at that point of reaching your true potential. But it's what can you do to get to a point where you are managing what is within your control. And so if we look at this piece, I'm sure some of you will have seen it before, but it's basically Stephen Covey's circle of control. And so it's looking at how can you control the controllables, essentially. And so, like, when we look at the things that are concerning us at the moment, there's so many things that we are absolutely concerned about, but we have zero control over what happens. So if we look, for example, how long this whole COVID crisis is going to go on for, in part, there are things that we can do to influence, but broadly, we're concerned about it, but it's outside of our control. The economic fallout is another piece. Constant disruption is another piece that's outside of our control. If we do get into that second wave, again, there's things that we can all do on an individual level to try our best to influence, but we can't actually control it. Employer requirements. If your employer has a requirement of you that is something that really isn't ideal for you at the moment, but it's their requirement, and that's the business requirement, again, it's something that you can perhaps try and influence how it's delivered on, and it's something that would absolutely be concerning you, but not necessarily within your control. So it's looking at, okay, within this, and we won't do it today because we don't have time, but I highly recommend that you each take time to kind of list out the, what are the things that are concerning you. With that, what can you influence and what's within your control? And so if we look at influence, there are some of the things I just mentioned. So the length of the crisis, for example, we can all play our part. I don't need to go through the different things that we can do there. We're hearing so much about it, like doing your part, doing what you can to try and influence. Employer requirements, if your employer is asking something of you that you're finding quite difficult, having open communication. Communicating as best you can as to what the challenges are for you, and trying to find, even if it's an interim solution, is something you can try and influence it. But in terms of, if we look at what's within our control, so what's within your control, your communication style is within your control. So like taking the time to make sure that you are communicating where you're at, what you're, how you're feeling, what your needs are as you're returning to work. If that is in the case of a bit of a kind of interim business plan, let's say, or business case, because there's something that you really want, it's within your control to pull that together and try your best to influence to get what you need. Your daily routine. So last week we were talking about, feeling quite anxious and ambivalent there, but what can you do to try and take control of your day? And I'm sure lots of you have had so much experience of this over the last number of months, different things that you can do to build into your daily routine, to look after your physical and mental well-being where you can, because that's something, your health and well-being is as much in your control, and taking the time to look at what you need for that. And really your response to negativity. I think this is something that lots of people have learned through over the last number of months, with all the kind of doomsday predictors and negativity out there. We can't control that, but how you respond to it, or what information you expose yourself to, is within your control. So I'd say taking the time to write that out for yourself, and then the reason why you would do that is because you want to focus the vast majority of your energy on what's within your control. And sometimes just writing it out can be really, really helpful, just to kind of put it in a frame of reference for yourself, and then think about, okay, something is outside of my control, but I can perhaps influence. I can influence by talking to my employer, talking to my manager, if it's something to do with your employment. So that's very broadly, very briefly, kind of looking at change and transition, and how you can control the controllables for yourself. If we move on to adapting to the new work environment, but what can be really helpful in this space is just having a review, like review of what's changing. And this picture, I've put this up here because it is a COVID picture, but it's back like we never left. But really, it's not like that at all, and it's very different. And so what can be really, really helpful is taking the time to look at what is going to be different, and knowing that before you come back, or as you're transitioning back. And if it's something that you're feeling quite anxious about, working through for yourself, okay, I come back, what's it going to be like on a day-to-day basis? So if we look at the office practicalities, so say, for example, what's changing for you on your commute to work. So if, for example, you're taking the bus and everybody is wearing a mask, are there any options around that for you, or is that what you need to do? You arrive at your workplace and your destination, what's different there. As you enter into your building, you come and you sit at your desk. What's that like? What's different about your desk? If there are meetings, what's changing in that context for you? If you want to grab a cup of coffee, what's different? If you want to take a toilet break or lunchtime. So it can be really helpful just to work down through for yourself what is actually changing, and think about, if you don't know the answers to any of that, it's something to ask your manager and seek clarity on, just so that you have a full understanding of what's going to be different. When we look at new ways of working, for many people, they're going to be, I've heard lots of different situations of like team A and team B, like week on, week off, or day on, day off, working from home and in the office. So taking the time to just take stock and think about what is that going to look like. If you don't have clarity on that, to seek clarity. So that's actually kind of what's within your control. Ask the questions, try and find out. If you're doing, say, a team A and team B scenario, what's the plan over the next while? How long is it likely to go on for, if that's known? The health and safety protocols, I've put some links in the resources slide at the end around the return to work protocol and so on. But look, there's so much information up there, and hopefully, particularly those of you who are already back, your employer has briefed you on what needs to change from a health and safety point of view as you come back. But if there's anything that you're unsure about there, again, I'd say seek clarity on that. But other things that might be different would be around, in addition to health and safety statements or procedures, you might find that there's new kind of sickness and absence, new leave procedures, perhaps new disciplinary grievance, and so on. So making sure that you fully understand what is changing. And then other things around, like looking ahead, the culture and norms. And so this is going to be different for every team, every organization, but what way have things worked previously and what might be different. So if, for example, you had kind of casual get-togethers on a Friday, might that change, and so on. So just kind of taking the time to think about it. I know if you're in Iconic, they're doing sessions tomorrow and the next day, I think, where they're talking about it from an Iconic point of view, what's different. So that can really help, because it's really just making sure that you have as much clarity as possible, so you can plan your return and plan and think about how that's going to work for you. Okay, so employer and employee obligations. So I am going to come on to the Q&A in a minute, but some of the big things that are coming up here is around returning to work and returning to the office. So in some cases, I don't think there's anyone on the call about it, but if your business has been closed, your company was closed and you're coming back, So what's the obligations there? Or if you've been working from home and you have been called back to the office, and perhaps you do, or maybe you're delighted, maybe you don't want to do that. Workplace health and safety, there are quite a lot of obligations around this, and two big ones is around health and safety legislation. So as you return to work, I mean, if you're going back to the office as you were before, like a lot of this will be in place, and then there's the need for the additional COVID related pieces. But if you're continuing to work from home for a point, there is, specific employee and employer obligations around your health and safety. That you're making sure that, say for example, that you're logging any incidents that happen when you're working from home. So I've put a link to that in the resources, but it's something that, as I said, we were kind of making do for a period of time, but there is a need to make sure that you are meeting your obligations and your employer is meeting their obligations. Required change terms and conditions. This is something, again, that's coming up a lot. And the main thing I'd say here is that you need to agree to any changes to your terms and conditions. So I'm hearing lots of kind of needs to change working arrangements or working hours. Let me see what else, moving into a different role. And so that's something really that requires a discussion with your employer, but you do need to sign to say that you're agreeing to changes, any kind of contractual changes. And look, the main thing, and I've said this in the employer piece as well, like all the same legislation all still exists, it's all still there, and the obligation to treat employees fairly is still there. And obviously, from a employee perspective, the obligations to, your obligations as a general employee, they all still remain. But there are just some very specific ones around. So, say for example, if we look at returning to the office, it's one that's come up quite a lot, where people have been working from home and they want to continue to work from home. But unless it's specifically outlined in the contract of employment, there is no requirement for your employer to facilitate you to work from home if that's not what they want for their business. Now, that said, if we look at, say, Citizens Information.ie or the Workplace Relations Commission or government guidelines, there has been a broad call for employers to try and to come up with solutions, like to work with employees to come up with solutions where they aren't in a position to return to the office. So say, for example, somebody mentioned there about childcare. So if you don't have any childcare in place and you're returning to the office, you don't have the right, I guess, to continue to work from home, but through discussions with your employer, it's trying to come up with some arrangement that is mutually agreeable for an interim period. And so if we look at that, perhaps you're talking about through until September, we don't quite know yet, but trying to come up with some agreement. And oftentimes when there's a bit of a disagreement in this, it comes back to not, starting with clear communication. Often the employer doesn't really understand the challenges that you haven't communicated them, so taking time to make sure that you're clearly outlining what the impact of the change is, and trying to find a way that would help on an interim basis. We talked about the obligation to work from home, but I would hope for the most part through discussion with your employer that you would be able to reach some kind of interim arrangement, at least that would suit. But I do think kind of open communication is key there. Another piece would be not feeling safe to come back to work. And so within this, I think it's really important that you get all the information that you need from your employer about what measures have been put in place. And so from an employer point of view, if they are fully implementing all the government guidelines and the return to work protocol, then they are doing what they need to do in order to facilitate a safe return to work. So however, if you feel that they're not doing, if they're not doing what's needed, I'd say, seek clarity about that, and perhaps it's actually communication about if you feel that you can highlight where things are not being done. But I suppose essentially, if they are doing everything that's required, well then, and you're required to be back at work, then you can raise an issue and say that you're not happy, but once they've met the government requirements, there isn't a huge argument to say that you don't feel safe. Now, if it's a case that somebody in your family is high risk, or you're high risk and you don't feel that you're ready to return to the office, again, I would say talk to your employer and try and see, is there some kind of interim arrangement, particularly as we're looking at kind of talk of a second wave, even just to buy a few weeks to see kind of what we're dealing in with that, to try and reach agreement on that. And in some cases, look, that could be a case of, if it's maybe your employer would be willing to waive the notice period for parental leave, or perhaps you could take some unpaid leave or use some of your annual leave, and seeing are there kind of options around that, just to buy a little bit of time. I think if you have a medical concern yourself about returning to work, I say your first port of call is to speak to your GP, because really, if you feel that the risk is too high for you, it's getting medical guidance. And perhaps your employer might want you to see an occupational health advisor that would specifically look at your medical needs in the context of the type of work that you do, but on a confidential basis. But I'd say that would be the port of call to go there. I'm just trying to think of other pieces. Some things that have come up have been around the commute to work, where I have heard some people say that employers are asking that they don't take public transport, that that employees cycle or walk to work. I don't know if that's relevant to anyone here. And I'd say, in the same way, from a health and safety point of view, I'd say from an employee point of view, as long as an employer is satisfying all the return to work protocol and the government guidelines, there's not much you can do about it. Same way, if an employer is saying to you that we don't want you to take public transport, but you are meeting the government guidelines in terms of you're wearing a mask, then there isn't really, if that's the way that you need to get to work, that's the way that you need to get to work. Okay, so this is somebody who had hoped to kind of continue to work from home, given that productivity remained high. Is there anything that can be done to convince employers of the value of working from home? This is a really tricky one, because, as I said, like, there's no, employers are not obliged to facilitate working from home. But if you have information about productivity remaining high, and I think one of the big business cases for working from home is that it can have a really good impact on productivity. But this whole pandemic situation has been completely different. And so if you're able to demonstrate that your productivity remained high through the pandemic while working from home, to me, that's a pretty solid start for that. It would, get higher, continue, or if not get higher, if you continue to work from home over a period of time. But to me, in terms of convincing employers, I'd say try to build your business case. Look at the research out there about working from home. Where are you flexible? Is it possible to look at working from home? Are you looking for completely work from home, or is 1 day a week? How would that work for you? Is it possible that your employer wants to get everybody back to the office and then might consider working from home? Or let me see, I'd say pulling your business case together, asking them even if something that could be done on an interim basis. So I'd say you can't force them to accommodate you working from home, but I'd say doing what you can to gather your evidence, a strong, solid business case, trying to look for it to be approved on a short-term basis, enough time that you'd be able to demonstrate what the value is. So if you said to do it for the next few months and see how it goes, that would be my best advice. You want to try and gather all your evidence that it's really hard to say no, that it's actually, it's just that you've such a solid rationale that it would be better to work from home. But then also trying to understand from their point of view, what is the reasons why they don't want it to happen? Is it that they're concerned about the culture over the team, that they want to bring everyone back together? And if that's the case, what can you do that would facilitate you to work from home and be a strong part of the team? And so thinking about it. So I say initially try and understand where their concerns are, what's the reasons that they don't want to do it, and then building a business case that addresses all those areas. Let me see. What leave can somebody take when someone they need to take care of is diagnosed with COVID-19? Yeah. It depends who. If I said I do have a link in the end to that goes in a bit more detail around if you can't come to work. So if it is, for example, a dependent, so if it's a child, then you could be talking about using some of your parental leave. There is force majeure leave, but it just amounts to a few days. And if it's if your presence is essential in taking care of somebody, I think it's 3 days, but you can seek it's 5 days over 3 years. So if it's urgent and you're absolutely needed, you could seek to take those 5 days. But if it's slightly more longer, it might not help you. But I'd say, yeah, trying to look at, some employers have put in special paid leave for this, others haven't. You might be looking at force majeure, a bit of parental leave. If it's not a dependent, you might need to use some of your annual leave or look for kind of special unpaid leave. I'd say talk with your employer and see what they have in place. Being nervous about seeing other employees is something that has come up in other sessions, and so I'd say, this is one where, like, what's within your control here? Open communication. So, as I said, there are going to be some people that are going to be hop, skipping and jumping back to the office and can't wait to see people, and other people who perhaps they do have people at high risk around them and are particularly nervous about coming back. And so what can you do? I say talk to your employer, but it would be great in that situation to try and get some sort of agreement across the team that you have a way of everybody saying how they feel as you're coming back to the office, so that your needs are being respected and everybody's needs are being respected by how you feel when you're coming back. Let me see, being worried about job security, I think that's a very valid one. And again, if I'm looking at this from an employer point of view, I would always recommend to try and keep your employees updated, and even if there is no update, to update that there is no update, because sometimes it's a void of information that can really that you can fill with kind of thinking that there's lots of plans going on in the background. I do think that's one of the things about uncertainty over the next while. I'd say if you're particularly worried about what's going to happen with your job, I'd recommend that you talk to your employer and see, can they give you any reassurances, or can they give you a timeline when you might know a little bit more, to try and see what you can control within that. Another one is about going on holidays. Can your employer stop you? And so, we're still waiting on this list to be published. Not sure when it's going to happen, but I mean, look, as it stands, it's recommended no unnecessary international travel. If we're looking at that from that point of view, I think, as long as it's permitted from a government guidelines point of view, you have the right to go somewhere. But I would expect employers would want to put in place procedures around that to make sure that all their employees and customers are being they're managing the risk across the board. If that question relates to you wanting to take annual leave and your employer is saying no, then yes, say absolutely. It's within their rights to say that you can't take it. Or if they may decide they don't want you to take it within a set period of time, they can do that as well, but they need to give you a month's notice about the intention to do that. Okay, I think that's kind of bringing us up on the time. If there's any last questions, do pop them in to the chat box. I'm just going to bring up the resources page here. So these are some relevant pieces. That's the government guidelines on the return to work safety protocol. There's lots of information up there and links to other information. And then around employer and employee obligations, you'll find them on citizensinformation.ie. There's employment rights during the COVID restrictions, which still apply because it's about working from home and that one. And then very recently, most updated yesterday, I think, is returning to work and COVID-19. Not working out. Okay, so look, that brings me to the end. I suppose just, if anybody does want to get in contact, if you have any questions afterwards, my website is strengthwithin.ie. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or my email is claire@strengthwithin.ie. I'll obviously see if I can help. But yeah, well, listen, thank you so much.